Andrew Yang, what do you think so far?
Oh, well, it's projecting to be a really great day for Bernie, which I think all of us expected. One thing I just want to put out there, I'm not sure why we're still using caucuses in some of these early states, that they're really bad for turnout. I mean, you're looking at 3% of Nevadans caucusing in 2016. This time it might be as high as 4 or 5%. In New Hampshire, with a primary, it's much, much simpler. You had 20% plus. And so if you're going to be a democracy and you're trying to empower voters, why would you make it harder for people to vote in your earliest nominating process? I do want to say the problem with the Bernie movement narrative is that he's winning with like 25, 26, 28%. And that includes even in a state like New Hampshire that he won cleanly with over 50% last time. You have the other votes getting split up among 4 other candidates. Really, to me, the action after today is what happens among candidates 2 through 5.
Right.
Because they're going to have some very, very tough conversations. And then if the field consolidates, the question is, what percentage of the vote is Bernie getting?
Right.
I think what's important to recognize, though, is that what seems to be the case, at least looking at these numbers, is that Bernie Sanders is also doing well with moderates, too. So whereas I feel like that argument could be said for New Hampshire and Iowa, we're seeing that he is winning support across moderates, and it's less ideological, and it's more about who is prioritizing the needs of the working.
This is the question, but people like winners in general. Like a lot of people are looking up being like, like I'm starting to warm up to this guy. Just because after you start putting up a bunch of number ones next to your name,
that's true.
You start looking better.
Everyone's a Yankees fan.
This notion of if Biden comes in second, that gives new life to him. Is that, Andrew, I mean, is that really a real notion?
Yeah, it is. I mean, moderates have been trying to figure out who to try and consolidate behind. If Joe puts up a strong second place result here, a lot of the donors that have been on the fence could come his way. He has relationships with many of them, and they've been waiting for him to demonstrate strength. To me, one of the big outcomes of today is what happens to Amy Klobuchar if she finishes, let's say, 5th. And I'm friends with all these candidates, so it's hard to talk like this. But if you finish 5th in Nevada and you're heading to South Carolina and you're Amy Klobuchar and you're not expected to do really well in South Carolina, then it starts prompting some really, really difficult conversations. And that's what many people have been waiting for, is for the moderates in the field to start consolidating. So if Joe comes up strong today and let's say a candidate ends up leaving the field in the coming days, because if you imagine, let's say, an Amy Klobuchar dropping out, I don't think those voters are going to Bernie.
Right. The hard questions, the real hard questions that I think Andrew's referring to is what is the objective here? Do the moderates candidates just want to be in the race to prove that they can stay in? Or do they want to be in the race so that they can see a candidate who is like-minded advance? And I think, frankly, it does not seem like any of them are really thinking in those terms right now. And as a result, Bernie Sanders is running away with the race, and Michael Bloomberg is, waiting until Super Tuesday where he's likely to make a big impact.
I'm going to give 3 key variables for a candidate if they're looking at the road ahead. Number 1, are they in the next debate? Number 2, do they have the money to operate? Because you're right, Amy's operation is much, much smaller than Elizabeth's. And number 3, if you project a contested convention, are you going to finish strongly enough to hoover up delegates in the states, which often means something like a 15% plus threshold? When I decided to drop, it was in part because I looked at these 3 variables and I said, I don't think I can get delegates moving forward. If I thought I could get delegates, I'd still be in the race and I would not be here having this delightful conversation with you all. But so really, that is the question for each of the candidates. If they think they can be, if not the king or queen, but the king or queen maker at the convention, then they probably stay.
Can I say something? With Trump in 2016, we had the same conversations, like which one of these people is going to drop out in the interest of the greater good? But the reality is these politicians.
One thing, I just wanted to ask our ex-candidate here. We were talking before about the moderates and stuff. Do these people talk to each other about what to do next or how they're going to behave to Bloomberg, or can we moderates get together, as we were talking about before? We thought it was foolish.
The way it works between campaigns is like this. You have like the candidate to candidate relationship, and a lot of the candidates have each other's cell phones, but we're not in the habit of texting each other, being like, hey, what do you think?
How are you?
That sort of thing. Yeah, so most of the communication happens from team to team. And politics is incestuous enough such that everyone on every team knows someone on someone else's team. So if I looked at my team and was like, hey, I want to talk to Biden's team would be like, oh yeah, I know his XXX is like chief of staff, is this and that. So the question is whether the staffers on different campaigns are having these conversations, and then after it reaches a certain level, then it graduates up to the candidates typically.
And what would the conversations be? I guess that's my question at this point.
So you do have teams talk to each other, and then occasionally someone would say to me like, hey, FYI, Joe wants to call you. And I'm like, sure. And then you schedule that call and then you have that convo. So I have a feeling that the campaign-to-campaign communications are already happening. And then the question is whether it reaches the candidates.
Do you think they coordinated in advance on the kneecapping of Bloomberg, or do you think that was just spontaneous?
I think that was organic and spontaneous. I think we may see some more of that on Tuesday.
Andrew, do you think that this impacts Bernie Sanders one way or another? Mayor Buttigieg is apparently already fundraising off this notion of the Russians supporting Sanders or trying to get him elected.
Well, I don't think anyone believes for a moment that Bernie is somehow courting that kind of help. It just speaks to the need that we have to secure our social media and our election infrastructure from Russian interference. Just want to make a note on these vote totals. I'd keep an eye on Pete Buttigieg because his campaign has a knack for getting extra delegates in the rural counties. They did it in Iowa to great effect. And so since the delegate count is going to be the final count here, I have a feeling that they may overperform the popular vote a bit because that strategy worked for them in Iowa. We tried to do the same thing in Iowa, my campaign. We did not do it as effectively as Pete. Pete's campaign is very, very good at maximizing delegate returns.
How do you go about doing that?
I mean, what's the way?
What you do is you go to the less trodden paths in rural counties where they have slightly disproportionate delegate output based upon the number of humans you get to show up to the caucuses. So what that means in practice is that Pete organized, advertised, and appeared more in rural parts of Nevada that you get better bang for your buck rather than Vegas and Reno.
Blaming the Washington Post, trying to sort of say who the sources were and why this came out the day before the primary, and then as if the Washington Post, if it had this story, should not have reported it or should have.
I think the question of timing is a good one, but it's not about the Washington Post. It's about who.
It's about the story.
It's news. Right. It's genuinely newsworthy.
I don't know where Steyer's going to end up or whether he's going to end up out after this, and maybe Andrew, you could talk about that. But he has been spending a lot of money in South Carolina, and he spent a bunch of money in Nevada.
Yeah, the thing to look out for is whether Tom gets a qualifying poll tomorrow in South Carolina.
Yep.
If he does, then he'll be on the debate stage the following day. And South Carolina is his strongest state. If he doesn't get a poll, then he won't be on the debate stage. And that's going to be a source of great frustration for him and his campaign because they've been putting a lot of resources into South Carolina in particular.
Is this going to be a candidate who only plays to his base or becomes more inclusive? Now may be too early because he's trying to win. But at a certain point, Bernie Sanders is going to have to do sort of a more of a big tent.
Andrew, how do you see this?
Well, first, I agree with everything that you said, Van. This is why I ran. And when I went around to Democrats, not Democrats, working class Americans around the country, if you have a D next to your name, it's like a scarlet letter. Like, they do not think Democrats speak to them. And I was talking to truck drivers and waitresses, and I was like, theoretically, aren't you who the Democratic Party should be speaking to and standing up for? But they thought that the Democratic Party wanted nothing to do with them. And that is, to me, a real problem with the Democratic Party. You have to do some soul searching if working class Americans think that your party is not their party. That's why I ran. I ran to say, look, we have to solve these underlying economic issues that have been festering and building up in our communities for years and decades that got Donald Trump elected. And to me, the Democratic Party never really reckoned with how the heck do you lose to Donald Trump?
Yeah.
And then you just blame everything under the sun. Like,
on the establishment.
Even if you add up, something that people were doing a couple of weeks ago, which is adding up support for all the moderates, and then comparing it to Sanders, you still can't catch Bernie Sanders.
I'm the math guy, and you beat him by a smidge.
All together.
Well, let's leave the math to it.
My question to Elizabeth Warren is, where actually do you win a primary?
She's got a very big, expensive team, and it hasn't paid off at the ballot box yet.
Yeah.
They're all, you don't believe them. I mean, they're all like, we exceeded expectations, says Amy Klobuchar. We had a great night.
This has been the sort of legacy of the caucuses.
You've had great nights when you lost.
I have had great nights.
Andrew, I'm wondering what you think, just kind of running through the top 4 or 5, what did they need to do now? I mean, what is Joe Biden clearly thinks South Carolina or is saying that South Carolina he's going to win.
Well, the rest of the field needs to consolidate, ideally, and each candidate wants to be the last person standing to absorb the non-Bernie energy. The problem for Bernie is that, he's unlikely to get an outright majority of delegates heading into the convention, which is going to set the stage for the superdelegates to emerge. And then you're looking at a contested convention, which is also the dream scenario for all of the other non-Bernie candidates, because they're going to go in there with delegates. The superdelegates, let's say, are not going to be favorably disposed towards Bernie, and then each of the remaining candidates will say, like, I'm the pick. So that's the dream that's going to keep every other candidate in the race.
But I think what Andrew's trying to say is everybody needs to just drop out. One or more of them need to figure out, probably more in the vicinity of probably 2 or 3.
I was going to say,
figure out who's going to be the one to step back.
Someone needs to pull an Andrew Yang. Be like, I've done the math. I'm not going to win.
No road forward.
How hard is that for a candidate to have a conversation with himself or herself and her staff and say, okay.
That's why you have to hire Andrew Yang to do the math for them.
It's not gonna happen. I think it's gonna get nasty. Well, you can answer that then.
Well, it's tough going in both directions, Gloria, because we were talking about if you have a bad night and you get up in front of the crowd and be like, it was a great night. On some level, it does ring hollow. It's hard to continue beating that drum. So it's hard to drop out, but in some cases, it's hard to keep going.
But who should drop out? I mean, honestly, who's supposed to drop out for who at this point?
They have to make the case to voters that there is an alternative to the guy who's winning right now, and nobody has wanted to do that so far.
I think this was really smart by Pete, and he was clearly trying to do it on the debate stage earlier this week, and it became a pile on Bloomberg. And meanwhile, Bernie was just like sailing out, being like, hey, I'm the front runner, I guess I'm just going to coast. And Pete was like, no, I'm going to try to jab you, Bernie. And he did it tonight, and I can guarantee you he's going to do it on Tuesday night, because Pete sees that Bernie's the front runner. He's trying to become the alternative to Bernie, and the best way to do that is by saying, I am the alternative to Bernie. So I think that other candidates should probably follow suit. I think Amy, Joe,
afraid to.
Elizabeth should be trying to contrast themselves with Bernie more. I'm a huge admirer of Elizabeth's, but I referenced this a little bit earlier on. They made a very big bet early on in terms of hiring field organizers, not just in the early states, but around the country. And those organizers are not something that you can just adjust and recalibrate that quickly. They're not like ad spending. And so they have a really fixed overhead that's higher than many of the other campaigns. They get these resources in. They've been playing it close to the bone in terms of their finances. They took out a loan recently that I'm sure they've long since paid back. But to Van's point, it's going to be hard to activate these resources in a way that's going to move the needle towards victory in one of the states that are upcoming.
Andrew Yang, I heard you saying this as Diane Gallagher was reporting. This hurts candidates. This hurts the candidate.
Yeah, if I'm a candidate, I'm really angry. I was angry after Iowa, and I'm trying to be forgiving about, it's like a technical failure, but imagine being a candidate or a campaign that spent months and months of your time, thousands of volunteer hours, staff, blood, sweat, and tears, and then them coming and saying, like, hey, we don't know what happened. It's incredibly frustrating. And if you're going to try and propel any of the candidates forward, you owe quick results to the American people. To me, the best process would be primaries with ranked choice voting. And this is something I was talking to Van about. If you had ranked choice voting, Donald Trump would not be our president today, because he was consistently getting 30% of the vote or so.
When you say ranked choice voting, you just mean voting.
Well, it's just you vote and then you list, let's call it your 3 top candidates, and then your votes flow to whoever is left standing if your first choice, isn't contending. And so, if you had ranked choice voting, let's say Jeb Bush, if you were a Jeb Bush voter, your second choice was probably not Donald Trump. It was going to be someone else. And the same is true on the Democratic side. This is actually be a massive process improvement. And for people who are concerned about, let's say, an insurgent coming and running the table with 30% of the vote while you have 4 other candidates splitting the rest, ranked choice voting would help that immensely.
Can we just say this got to be the end of these caucuses? I know Harry Reid will kill me because he created this for Nevada, and it's important to Nevada, and it's important to the Democratic Party enough for having 3 separate sets of answers or results for one caucus? I mean, this is crazy.
It's crazy.
The Buttigieg campaign and the Biden campaign both claiming second place, and everybody's putting out their own numbers that are not verified by the Democratic Party.
And who knows what the Russians are doing?
Everyone gets to declare themselves a winner, and I think what we saw after
we all
Iowa,
lose.
what we just Tom Steyer crater.
Which he might.
Which he did tonight.
I mean, if you look at what happened tonight, he was expected to do. I mean, I don't know that I believe the polls showing him. You know, there were some polls showing him doing really, really well. But I think people were expecting him to do a little bit better than he's doing now.
One thing to watch out for, Abby, and this happened to me in Iowa. I got 5% of the popular vote, and then the graphic showed 1%. I was very like, arr. So with Tom, it shows 3.7, but he got 8 or 9 of the popular. It's just the caucus dynamics. He was below viability, and he got compressed as a result. So I think that his numbers in South Carolina may be closer to his polling. Right now, it feels like the most likely scenario is a contested convention in Milwaukee because none of the candidates, including Bernie, is on track to get a majority. And if there's one thing I've learned about Democrats is Democrats really like to follow the rule book. And you saw it at the end of the last debate where they asked the candidates, hey, if someone comes in with a plurality, what do you do? And like every other candidate was like, follow the rule book. Let the convention take its course, which means the superdelegates will come out. They will come out in force, probably not for Bernie. And then you're going to have this journalistic dream come true of a contested or a nightmare, depending upon where you sit. But that strikes me as the most likely scenario because I do not think other Democrats are going to fall in line just because Bernie ends up with more delegates than any other candidate.
Are all y'all paying attention? Automation gonna sweep the nation unless we get him in. Andrew Yang, 2020 freedom dividend. Climate change is real again. Science rules. Teachers bringing home some bread. Medicare for every citizen. Andrew Yang, 2020 freedom dividend.